Hello, friends. I'm sorry we can't meet together in person tonight. As I came into church a little while ago, the sidewalk was pretty icy and the steps were pretty icy, and it just seemed to be best that we not meet. But I wanted us to have a chance to review our Bible study from last week a little bit to prepare us for next week's Bible study. And if you didn't make last week's, you get a chance to enjoy this review. We are studying the book of Habakkuk, and I want to share with you the first 4 verses from the book of Habakkuk. This is Habakkuk praying to God on behalf of his people and also regarding some concerns he has about his people. So here is what he prays. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not listen? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see wrongdoing and look at trouble? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law becomes slack, and justice never prevails. The wicked surround the righteous. Therefore judgment comes forth perverted. And we talked a little bit about the context of this was King Josiah, good King Josiah, had been killed by the Egyptians. And they put his second son, Jehoiakim, on the throne. And Jehoiakim was only interested in saving his own skin. And so he was allied with the Egyptians until it looked like the Babylonians were going to take over. And then he allied with the Babylonians. And then when it took them a while to conquer the Egyptians, he went back and allied with the Egyptians again. And the whole time, he was only interested in saving his own skin. And Habakkuk was just so convinced that this was going to lead to the downfall of Judah, which ultimately it did. Because rather than trusting in God, Jehoiakim was just reaching out, seeking whatever it was that he thought might save his own skin. And we talked about the fact that that was a very time in the history of Judah that was very uncertain. They just didn't know from one day to the next what was going to happen. And so Habakkuk offers this prayer. How long, O Lord, am I going to see all of that? And yet, he is not praying about the Babylonians or the Egyptians. He's not praying about evil that's going on elsewhere out in the world. He's really talking about his people. How long am I going to see within the borders of Judah, within my own people, people being violently oppressed and justice not being given to those who need justice? He's praying for his people and praying about situations in his culture. And we talked about the fact that that is very similar to the fact to the land in which we live, the culture in which we live, where we look around and we see all kinds of things in our world that are troubling. The Sochi Olympics are getting ready to begin, and rather than celebrating sport, what we're hearing on the news every night is about the threat of terrorism and how that these Olympics are imperiled by people that are not interested in sport, and we live in these uncertain times. We know just from a few years ago how fragile the economic situation in the world is, and how just overnight almost the economy of the world can collapse. And so we live in these uncertain global times, and yet we also began to talk about the fact that this prayer really isn't for those global massive issues as much as it is a prayer for the church when we're trying to read it and interpret it through the lens of the church. And we have to recognize that within our own church culture, we are often like Jehoiakim. We are so interested in our survival, and we look around and we realize that the church in America is diminishing. It's diminishing in numbers, it's diminishing in influence, and it's scary for us, and we may be tempted to grab at whatever we can like Jehoiakim did in order to make sure that we survive. And I loved our discussion last time, even though it made some of us a little uncomfortable, because we began talking about social issues and some of the ways that the church should respond to some of the great social issues of our day. And what we discovered was within our room of just 18 or 20 people, we had a tremendous difference of opinion on some of the main social issues of our day. And it's some of the differences of opinion of those things that really tear people apart sometimes. And we talked about the fact that one of the wonderful strengths of First Baptist Church is that we don't live in a far-right bubble and we just ignore all of the other stuff going on in our culture, and we don't live in a far-left bubble and we can just ignore what all is going on in our culture, but we really live at the intersection of those bubbles. And so we have people in our church who are on both sides of some of the major issues that are facing us. And sometimes I think when we are that way, we might accuse those whom we see on the other side as being like Jehoiakim. Well, you're just giving in to the culture. You're just caving into the culture. Or you're just caving into the way things have always been, or not willing to change, not willing to see that things are different. But instead, I want to suggest that rather than trying to look at these social issues and figure out, well, what is the right stand to take on one issue or another, let's look at Jesus and how Jesus did that. Jesus' main issue in his world, the main social and economic and political and theological issue, was the Roman Empire. Do you succumb to the Roman Empire and collaborate with them, or do you fight the Roman Empire and resist them? And Jesus never really came down on one side or the other of that issue. He had disciples who were on both sides of that issue. And what he said instead was, when you're trying to decide what side, if you will, is God on, how do I live faithfully, he said, do this. Love God and love your neighbor. And everything else gets taken care of. Now, when I think about that, the first thing I think about is the fact that in John's epistle, he tells us that perfect love casts out fear. When we want to pray a prayer like Habakkuk, I am so afraid, God, because I look around in my church, and I look around at my culture, and I see so many problems, and I see so much violence, or I see so many things that threaten it. It terrifies me. We can look back and remember, perfect love casts out fear. And so at first, I let my heart flow towards God. Really, as Habakkuk was doing, his impulse was right. Let me turn to God and let God's perfect love begin to fill my heart and cast out that fear. And then I look around at all of those issues in our culture, and I recognize that every issue comes with a face, comes with many faces. And rather than saying, well, that person is evil, and that person disgusts me, and that person is too conservative for me, or that person is too liberal for me, or whatever, we say, how can I love my neighbor? And Jesus was very clear when the lawyer asked him, who is my neighbor? Neighbor is the Samaritan, who is the outcast, who is the religious and the political outcast. Neighbor is the person who's been beat up and lying on the side of the road, and who is a medical outcast. When the priest and the Levite passed by, one of the reasons they couldn't touch him was to touch him and get blood on them would make them unclean. And so they felt like they couldn't do that. But he is the one who is unclean that we're called to touch anyone. Neighbor is the one that we are afraid of. And Jesus says, love that person. And it really doesn't matter what I think about the issue. How can I truly, genuinely love that person? And my suspicion is that when we are praying to God, as Habakkuk did, how long are you going to make me see these things? God says to us, reach out in love, not to the issue, but to the person. And if you reach out to that person in love, then God can begin to transform my heart when I am trying to do that. God, I think, will transform our church, and God even will transform our culture through a few faithful, committed people who are more interested in loving God and loving neighbor than they are in being right on the issues. I hope that gives you something to think about tonight as you stay warm. I hope you can stay by a nice warm fire, or maybe get a nice cup of hot tea and enjoy this evening together with family, maybe with friends, even with our friend Habakkuk. And I hope to see you next week in Bible study, and even more importantly, I hope to see you on Sunday as we all worship together. We will have our combined service at 10:30. So Sunday school 9:30, combined service at 10:30, as we celebrate on Sunday being God's people together, being a church family together. I'll see you then. Stay warm.